Hello and welcome to another, I'm calling it a motorcycling video even though I'm not motorcycling. I'm going to talk in this video about NVES, that is New Vehicle Emission Standards, and I'm going to talk about them because we're in the middle of a federal election in Australia. This is in April 2025. The election will be on the 3rd of May, so all the information I give you is relevant to that federal election and things may change after that. And I'm talking about it because the alternate government, that is the Liberal National Parties, and the leader of the Liberal Party, Peter Dutton, who would be Prime Minister if a Liberal government was elected, has proposed that the new vehicle emission standards, which came into effect on the 1st of January 2025, and the first auditing period will be the 30th in June of 2025, he has said that he will keep the legislation but remove the penalties. So what I'm going to try and do in this broadcast is explain what the new vehicle emission standards are, how they work, what the penalties are and how they are accrued, and what motor vehicle manufacturers can do to avoid them. Now, I should say at the beginning, I'm not a member of any political party. I'm not advocating a vote for anybody or against anybody. I'm simply a bloke with a YouTube channel expressing an opinion and trying to explain a policy as I have understood it. If I am incorrect in anything, then if you're predisposed to do so, please comment and tell me where I am incorrect, and I will be happy to accept your better wisdom on the matter. Now, the new vehicle emission standards, this is how they work. The federal government in 2022, when it was elected, this current Labor government, when they were elected in 2022, they told the automotive industry that they were going to bring in vehicle emission standards and that they would come into effect in 2025. Now, the government was elected in May of 2022, so the vehicle manufacturers had 2.5 years to prepare for these, and they lobbied very successfully for them or against them, to the extent that they said there would be now two types of vehicles that would be assessed by them. One would be the general light passenger vehicles that most of us drive, and then there would be a second newly created group called light commercial groups, which would include heavier than passenger vehicles and covered most utes and vans and 4x4s, and they are assessed under a less stringent standard. But so what happens is that the government says vehicles are assessed by engine size and their mass, that is the mass of the vehicle when it's fully loaded, the gross vehicle mass, and says based on those two factors this vehicle should emit X amount of carbon. For the type 1, that is the light passenger vehicles, the small hatchbacks and the vehicles that most of us drive, that is 141 grams per kilometre of carbon. For the type 2, that is the light commercial vehicles, that are utes, large 4x4s, dual cab utes and vans, they are allowed to emit 210 grams of carbon per kilometre. Now, what happens is, if a manufacturer sells cars that come under that 141 grams per kilometre, then they are accruing carbon credits. If they sell more vehicles that exceed that level and then exceed the 210 grams level, they will be hit with fines. The fines will be, and I'm just going to make sure I can find the right information here, the fines I believe will be $100 per 100 grams of carbon above the allowable limit for the type of vehicle that is being assessed. I hope I've got that correct. If I'm incorrect about that, as I said, please let me know. Yes, it's 100 grams per kilometre, $100 for every gram per kilometre over the limit. So what is the problem here? Well, the problem here is that some vehicles that in Australia obviously exceed that carbon, the allowable amount of carbon emitted by them, and the manufacturers are saying, well, we have vehicles that can't meet the standard. How can they avoid fines and penalties? Because it's almost inevitable that if there are fines and penalties, that the consumer will pay for them. Lyndon Johnson, who was the President of the United States after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, was quoted once as saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so inevitably when there's a cost imposed on the manufacturer of any good, they pass the cost on to the consumer. So ultimately, if there are to be extra costs and if manufacturers are to be hit with these fines, which by the way don't become payable till 2029, so even though manufacturers may accrue fines in 2025 because they still have vehicles that are non-compliant, they have 26, 27, 28 to bring in vehicles that are compliant and therefore earn credits and therefore offset the fines that may occur in 2025. But so what can car companies do to avoid the fines? Well, the simplest answer would be to say, well, comply with the regulations, comply with the law, comply with the rules. But that would mean producing cleaner, more fuel-efficient engines. And I accept that that doesn't happen overnight. I accept that manufacturers need years of research and development and lots of money in order to come up with cleaner, more fuel-efficient engines. So that doesn't happen overnight. So option one isn't just snap your fingers, wave a magic wand, and we'll have lots and lots of cleaner engines and cleaner vehicles. Option two would be to say, well, we will simply delete from our models, or from our range of vehicles, any models that don't comply with the standards or are unable to meet the standards. And I believe, for example, one of the reasons that the Land Cruiser V8 has been deleted is because of that. The problem with doing that is to say some of those vehicles that they might delete are some of their best sellers. In Australia, I understand that something like 58% of all vehicle sales are of utes, that is dual cab utes, or large 4x4s. We love both of those things, even though many of us who drive utes aren't tradies, and many of us who drive large SUVs never go off-road. We love to drive those things. So the manufacturers would say, well, those vehicles are popular. We'll be cutting off our nose to spite our face. A second problem with that would be if you were a manufacturer who only had a couple of models, such as Isuzu, and remember, I'm just using examples here. I'm not endorsing a particular brand of car or criticising. I'm just using them as examples. The same with the pictures. They're just here for you to look at while I talk. So if you're Isuzu, for example, and you only produce or sell two models in Australia, and both of those are not likely to meet the standard, and you delete those models, you may as well go out of business, or you may as well leave the market because you have effectively left the market. And some consumers will say, well, now there's a reduction in choice. But seriously, if you wanted an Isuzu D-Max or the 4x4 that they sell, there are other choices. There are other vehicles that do exactly the same thing, that have the same specifications and are about the same price. But the problem would be if Isuzu, for example, were to say, well, we're going to delete those vehicles and therefore leave the Australian market. Anyone who already has an Isuzu suddenly has a vehicle that is value is significantly decreased because nobody wants to buy those cars second-hand. Dealers don't sell them, so they don't keep parts for them. So there's no money in keeping parts for a car we don't sell. Dealers don't train their technicians and mechanics as they ought to because they say, well, we don't sell those cars, so we don't have to, there's no point in us doing that, there's no money in it. So just simply deleting those vehicles isn't necessarily an option. Solution 3 would be to say, we will add more hybrids to our range. And I believe I'm correct in saying that Toyota have said, with the exception of the Hilux and maybe one other model, which I think might be the Land Cruiser V6, they have said that all the other models in their range now will only be hybrid in Australia. In other words, you can only buy a hybrid version of any vehicle that Toyota make, with the exception of the two that I mentioned, in Australia. Some companies will say, well, we don't make hybrids. And the answer might be, well, maybe it's time that you did. Maybe it's time you explored hybrids. Toyota have been making hybrids since the 1990s, and many other companies are now making hybrids, either of the plug-in or the traditional Toyota type, and they're not an unknown or unproven technology now. So maybe it's time for those manufacturers who don't have hybrids in their range to look at that as an option. Now, the fourth option is to say, well, we can't meet the standard and we're going to face penalties, which, as I said, will be fines of $100 per gram over the allowable emissions. But there are other companies who not only can meet the standard, they exceed it. They exceed it because they only make either plug-in hybrids or they only make EVs. And they will have credits. And they will have credits to sell. Now, they won't give them away. They will sell them to other car companies. You can buy credits from Tesla or BYD or whoever it is that has credits and therefore avoid the fines. But of course, if they buy those credits, like I said, the other car companies aren't going to give them away. They're going to sell them. So if they sell them, then that's a cost to the manufacturer, and that manufacturer is inevitably going to pass the cost on to the consumer. And it's claimed that, for example, the Toyota RAV4, which is a very popular model in the Toyota range, but also a very popular model in Australia, would rise in price by $9,700. Now, I'm not sure where that figure has come from, but there are some vehicles who the price of which could rise significantly if the manufacturers are unable to reach the approved standards in the approved time frame. For example, one of those would be the Mazda CX-5 Akira turbo petrol version. It emits 191 grams of carbon per kilometre, and its target is 148 grams of carbon per kilometre, so it could be fined an amount that is equivalent to $4,300 increase in the price of that car. The Nissan Patrol V8, it emits 334 grams of carbon per kilometre, and its target is 218 grams per kilometre. Now, if that were the only Nissan vehicle sold in Australia, and if in the period between now and the first auditing period, that is 2025, and the payment period, which will be in 2029, if in that period no other Nissan vehicles are sold in Australia and the Nissan Patrol V8 doesn't become a cleaner, more fuel-efficient engine, that would result in a fine of about $11,600, which inevitably would result in an increase in the price. But as I said, there are those four options with the manufacturers have before them. But there is a bigger issue here that I think is worth discussing. The opposition, that is the Liberal National Party, when the bills that the Labor government put to the Parliament were introduced to set up the new vehicle admissions scheme, the Liberal and National Party opposition voted against them. They passed the Parliament anyway because the Greens and crossbenchers voted in favour of them, and they passed the Parliament and went into effect as law on the 1st of January 2025. The Leader of the Opposition, that is Peter Dutton, has said what he will do is he will keep the legislation, but he will remove the penalties, because he says the penalties are a tax on hard-working Australians who need a reliable car. And remember, I'm not advocating a vote for anybody or against anybody. I'm simply trying to explain the policy as I understand it. Now, my problem with saying let's just keep the law but have no penalty is that we are relying on corporations to be good citizens and just obey the law. And we know from previous experience how well that has worked. Those of you who are old enough to remember only a few years ago the the controversy involving Volkswagen and their attempts to cheat emissions laws in other countries, laws that existed and fines that would have been levied against them. They found ways around them. So the idea of just saying, well, be a good corporate citizen, there's a good fellow, there's a law out there and we expect you to obey it, but there's no penalty if you don't, it doesn't seem to me to be much of an incentive for companies to do so. It's a little bit like, this is the best way I can explain it, it's a little bit like saying we have a law that says you shouldn't rob banks, but if you rob a bank and get caught, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. There's no penalty. So there's a law here that says you must work hard and develop engines that are cleaner and more fuel efficient and emit less toxic gases into the atmosphere. But if you don't, well, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. So why would the companies do anything? I accept that when a new government comes in, it has the right to say, well, there are policies that the previous government implemented or introduced that we don't agree with. And we have a right to change those policies. And in newly elected governments, rightly or wrongly, always claim we have a mandate to do this or that. Now, in this case, the government, the opposition, the alternate government has said, we are going to do this if we are elected to office. So they've told the public that they're going to do it. So they may well then say, with a straight face and with some degree of credibility, that we campaigned on this thing, we've been given a mandate, we're going to do it. My problem with that is this. Almost everywhere in the industrialised world or the developed world, except Australia and Russia, has some sort of new vehicle emission standards. The first Clean Air Act, I believe, was passed in the 1970s in California. And everywhere around the world, Europe, UK, North America, that is United States, Canada, and other countries around the world have emission standards for vehicles. And motor vehicle manufacturers operate under a thing called homologation. It's an ugly word, and what it simply means is that a motor vehicle manufacturer can make a motor vehicle and sell it in multiple markets because they have certainty that the rules surrounding the sale of that vehicle are pretty similar worldwide. The major difference would be whether they put the steering wheel on the right or left-hand side of the car. To put it simply, a Camry is a Camry is a Camry. No matter where you buy one, it's still the same car. The emissions are the same, the engine performance is the same. They may have different badges and different names in different countries, but they are essentially the same vehicle. And that is so that the manufacturer says, well, I make a vehicle and I can sell it in multiple markets, and I don't have to keep redesigning it for Australia or redesigning it for Europe or redesigning it for the North American market or whatever. I just make one vehicle. And so if these new vehicle emission standards or versions of them exist worldwide, and Australia has not created a new unsustainable standard, it has simply copied and pasted from standards that already exist worldwide. So the standards already exist. Manufacturers are already selling cars in other markets that have the same emission standards or better than we do. In fact, the only country that doesn't have them now is Russia. So if the manufacturers are already selling vehicles in other jurisdictions like Europe, like the United States, like Canada, that are clean or cleaner than the ones they're selling in Australia, why is there an issue of saying we can't meet a standard that's already in existence and which they are already meeting elsewhere? I find that's the difficult part that I have. But the other difficulty I have is this. As I said, I accept that a newly elected government of a different persuasion than the previous one has a right to say we don't agree with these things and we're going to change the laws to get rid of whatever it is we don't agree with. But the problem with doing that all the time is that motor vehicle manufacturing isn't a process that happens overnight. Designing a new car and creating a new model, either a facelift or a cosmetic change to an existing model or introducing a brand new model, is a costly and time-consuming business. Even if you are just updating an existing model, such as the recently released update to the Toyota Camry, you are still, in most cases, tweaking the performance of the engine so it's getting more kilowatts of power or more newton meters of torque, or it's more fuel efficient. And in case of the Toyota Camry, it's all of those things. The hybrid version is more fuel efficient than the previous version, and it's a more powerful engine with more kilowatts of power and more newton meters of torque. So that doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time for those things to happen. Now, the one thing that investors and manufacturers need is certainty. They need to know what the rules are and that the rules are not going to be constantly changing. If the rules are uncertain, or if there is uncertainty about what the rules are regarding the types of vehicles they can sell in a particular jurisdiction, then they will say, well, we'll just keep selling the old one. We'll just make the old one. We might upgrade the model for other markets where we know what the rules are, but since we don't know what the rules are going to be in Australia, we're going to just continue to produce the old model and send it over there. Now, I get that the alternate government has said, well, we'll keep the legislation, but we'll just remove the penalties. And as I said, that's a bit like saying, you're not supposed to rob the bank, but if you do this, don't worry about it, we're not going to do anything about it. So the regulations have come into force. The motor vehicle manufacturers had 2.5 years to prepare for them. They already meet the standard in almost every other jurisdiction except Russia where they sell vehicles, so they know what the standard is and they are able to meet it already. The legislation will remain in place, it's just that the penalties will be removed, and I'm not sure that's necessarily helpful to anybody. Some examples of how this will work, for example, is the Toyota RAV4 under the current scheme. It emits 107 grams of carbon per kilometre and its target is 141 grams of carbon per kilometre, so it's well under the target. The Suzuki Swift Auto Hybrid, for example, it emits 90 grams of carbon per 100 kilometres and its target is 126 grams of carbon per kilometre. So there are vehicles, that's how vehicles can meet the standard, or how companies can earn credits by saying, well, we already have vehicles that are under the standard. But of course, those standards are going to change over time and the targets are going to be progressively reduced as a way of ensuring that the air is cleaner and that emissions are reduced. Well, that's my thoughts on the matter. If you vote slowly on car issues, consider those when you're casting your vote. Have a good day. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment, leave it in the usual place. Thank you.